Racialized surveillance, still asking the question of, can we all just get along? This week's assignment takes me back to junior year in high school, 1991, in Dr. Edna Calhoun's class. First of all, Dr. Calhoun is cited as being the first black woman in Marlboro County, South Carolina to have earned her doctorate degree. And she never let us forget it. If someone would dare say, Mrs. Calhoun, she would say, Dr. Calhoun. I get it because she earned it. We walked in, most of us, having just gotten cable television or satellites in our homes, talking about how awful that Rodney King beating was. One of my classmates said, Dr. Calhoun, did you see the police beat that man like that? She said, yes, baby, and they should have beat him. My classmate said, Dr. Calhoun, why would you say that? They could have killed him. Dr. Calhoun said, baby, shut up. You kill people every day. My classmate said, Dr. Calhoun, I've never killed anybody. She said, yes, you have, baby, with your mouth and your harmful words. Baby, shut up. The discussion continued, but Dr. Calhoun's sentiments have resonated with me for decades. She said the reason she thought Rodney King should have been beaten is because he was at fault for drunk driving, refusing to pull over in a vehicle that may not have been his. Dr. Calhoun's sentiments parallel the tone of Roger Guenveur Smith's spoken word, in which he nor Dr. Calhoun believed this violent beating that caught the world's attention because of video footage captured by George Holliday was an instance of violence of identification. However, I do believe it was a textbook case of violence of identification because Rodney King was a young black man with prior brushes with the law. Rather, my 11th grade U.S. history teacher believes he got what he deserved for being in the first wrong. Roger Guenveur Smith believes that he should have, post-beating, been more aggressive to the establishment that nearly killed him. The style the producers used to open the video was the 911 call in which the late Rodney King's fiancée, Cynthia Kelly, called to report that Rodney was at the bottom of a pool, apparently unresponsive. Considering it was 21 years from the time he was beaten and when he died, there is not a direct correlation between the beating and the death by drowning to the concept of proximity to death. However, I would argue that the severe trauma from having been racially profiled and beaten with severe, inhumane police force heightened the rapidity of his death. Smith's tone towards Rodney King is one of mockery because Rodney King made the phraseology famous of, can't we all just get along? Smith believes that King was trying to let the world see that the police were right and he was wrong, and that he could emerge as the poster child of stopping riots. Smith feels that King kowtowed, and stepped and fetched for the police. And I believe Smith sees this behavior as, quote-unquote, selling out on behalf of King to a mainstream, racially polarized infrastructure that almost beat a man to death, who already at 26 years old had compounded vulnerabilities, as in he was a black man, he had a prior history of arrests, and had a history of alcohol and drug abuse. These already compounded vulnerabilities exemplify the uncomfortable, mathematics of black life as framed by Catherine McKittrick, which focuses on the areas of the intersectionality of black studies, anti-colonial studies, cultural geographies, and gender studies. Rodney King's compounded vulnerabilities are on display in these four intersectionalities because he was a black man, which is representative of gender studies that underscore the high percentage of incarcerated black men who are profiled outside of the prison walls and who become bait for the design of panopticon to fill the private prison industry and continue to be racially surveilled even inside the prison walls, causing many black men to be placed in lockdown, etc. In continuance with the intersectionality brought forth by McKittrick, King was a black man who lived in and was brutally beaten in the inner city of LA, which exposes the racial profiling that exists in many large cities, as studies reveal. In order to racially profile someone, it is an outpouring of the negativity associated with anti-colonialism, which shows that if people of color can be racially profiled, they are often not welcome in a plethora of spaces. Finally, Simone Brown provided a unique perspective for me of what surveillance looks like. She mentioned that she had two students in her class. One was a ghostwriter for Karl Rove and one who worked for Ivanka, whose father was 45. Although Brown did not say this, these students were surveilling her class, her curriculum, her views, her assignments, etc. I chuckled when she said the ghostwriter eventually dropped the class. However, the reality is he or she still was able to get what was needed, either overtly or covertly, by joining the class. When Brown mentioned Christina Heatherton, she said that she appreciated Heatherton's vantage point, in which she asked them to see surveillance as the anxiety of a state aware of its own illegitimacy. To see it as an anxiety is to see its own finitude and illegitimacy. This is where the work can start if the city's change agents are serious about subverting surveillance and the end of violence as a method of self-defense. Because that is what racial profiling, is. It is using surveillance of the eyes and ears, as well as high-tech cameras, etc., to penalize and hold captive demographics that the mainstream can typically, with ease, deem to be less than desirable. In tandem with Simone Brown's lecture, Aliyah Abdur Rahman's reading entitled The Enchantment of Being also supports the need for the obliteration of over-surveillancing the black community. She says African Americans' presence and participation in the ordinary, everyday behaviors and movements that characterize civic belonging are converted into ritualized iterations of racial subordination and exclusion, that is, into repetitive public stagings of racial harm. This is a recursive thought that aligns with the 1991 beating of Rodney King, which was full public harm on display. Abdur Rahman then goes on to cite and agree with Simone Brown's assertion that racialized surveillance is the fact of anti-blackness. I appreciate the fact that Simone Brown ended her lecture on the note of what the city's change agents can do to subvert using surveillance to quell its anxiety. Her having done this speaks loudly to what Afrofuturism looks like with regards to the optimism that one day the world will not fear, beat down, literally and figuratively, denigrate, and be uber suspicious of people of color. I will end with the way that I began, which is in a reflective mode. When KRS-One released Sound of the Police in 1993, I was a second semester freshman in college. I cannot say that it was in direct response to the Rodney King beating, but I can say that I do believe KRS-One was motivated by the compounded injustices and the overseer mentality that many police were and still are allowed to get away with over and over again. Even when KRS-One mentions how the black officers want to get a salary, it caused me to think about the Roger Guenveur Smith spoken word, in which he takes on the tone of having wanted Rodney King to be more aggressively and personally accountable for the way he responded to the officers that attempted to murder him. When KRS-One says, my grandfather and my great-grandfather and my great-great-great-great-grandfather had to deal with the cops, he asks, when is it ever going to end? It makes me reflect on Rodney King's question in the negative that we will all not be able to truthfully get along until a massive spiritual awakening, in which I'm wearing my t-shirt of He's Got the Whole World in His Hands, until a massive spiritual awakening occurs, or until people of color stop being dehumanized and over surveillanced. Thank you.